Hey everyone, welcome to the show. Have you ever had one of those moments where you're like, is this feminism or is this like kind of not sitting right with me?
Yeah, that's a really interesting feeling, right? That tension within feminism.
Totally. And that's actually what got me so hooked on this book we're diving into today, Enemy Feminisms. It's by Sophie Lewis, and it's nonfiction. You can find a link in the description. Oh, and before I forget, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives like this.
Yeah, enemy feminisms is a wild ride. Basically, Lewis argues that even though feminism is all about liberation, it's kind of like had these contradictions baked in from the beginning, and those contradictions have led to some seriously messed up stuff.
Yeah, she doesn't hold back. She straight calls them enemy feminisms.
Exactly. They're like these movements that use all the feminist buzzwords, like empowerment and equality, but then they push agendas that are actually super racist, classist, or just plain oppressive.
Like, whoa, using feminism to be anti-feminist.
Right. And the way Lewis starts the book is so interesting. She talks about being a kid and like totally vibing with the Queen of the Night from Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute, this powerful woman who's like, screw the patriarchy.
I kind of love that.
Me too. But get this, her dad was like, nope, you shouldn't admire her. She's wicked. You should be rooting for the nice patriarch.
Seriously. Even though he's the one, like, trying to control everyone.
Yep. And Lewis talks about how that like really messed with her as a kid, It pushed her away from embracing this rebellious, powerful female figure.
That's heavy.
Yeah, and she connects that experience to this wider societal thing where mothers are often scapegoated and put down even by their own daughters.
It makes you think about all the subtle ways we learn to, like, distrust or devalue women.
Totally. And that sets the stage for Lewis's exploration of enemy feminisms throughout history. Like she starts with this concept of the civilizer.
Okay, the civilizer. What's that all about?
Basically, it's this long history of white Western feminists who use the struggles of like non-white women to boost their own agendas. It's this sneaky kind of oppression and dressed up as like doing good.
Ah, I see. Like, we're helping you even though you didn't ask for our help.
Exactly. One example Lewis gives is the sugar boycotts in the 19th century. So on the surface, it's like, let's boycott sugar to end slavery, which sounds good, right?
Right.
But the thing is, those boycotts often ended up reinforcing racist ideas.
How so?
It was like white women positioning themselves as the saviors, swooping in to rescue their poor, helpless sisters.
Oh, wow. So even though they were fighting against slavery, they were still propping up this idea of white superiority.
Exactly. It was more about making white women look morally superior than actually dismantling the racist systems that created slavery in the first place.
Ugh, that's so messed up.
I know. And then Lewis brings up this fascinating woman named May French Sheldon. She was an American explorer in the late 1800s who traveled through East Africa. And get this, she called herself Bebe Bwana, which means white queen.
Wait, hold on. They just, like, gave herself that title?
Pretty much. She was all about this civilizing mission, but her expeditions were less about cultural exchange and more about low-key colonialism.
White queen, though. That's like a whole vibe.
Right. She thought her presence, just as a white woman, would make the native populations like awestruck and obedient. She'd even dress up in these fancy gowns and stage these ceremonies where African chiefs would propose to her.
Propose. Like, for real.
Yeah, but then she'd spin it as like pledges of brotherhood.
Oh, okay, I get it. So she's using this image of white womanhood to, like, exert her power and control.
Exactly. Sheldon's story is a prime example of how feminist ideas, even good ones, can be twisted to justify colonialism.
It's like intentions matter, but impact matters more.
Totally. And unfortunately, this wasn't just Sheldon being weird. This whole idea of white women being the civilizers of the world was pretty common in early feminist movements. They used it to justify interfering in other cultures, like dictating how women should dress or practice their religion.
So even though these women were fighting for change, their actions were still, like, rooted in racism and this sense of superiority.
Exactly. It shows us that we can't just take things at face value. We have to really dig into the motivations and consequences of these movements. And speaking of digging deeper, Lewis also talks about this crazy connection between some feminists and the Ku Klux Klan, especially during the fight for women's suffrage.
Whoa, wait, the KKK and feminists. How is that even possible?
It's a wild one, isn't it? But it makes more sense when you think about what was going on back then. The KKK in the 1920s, they presented themselves as defenders of traditional values, including this idea that white women needed to be protected and put on a pedestal. They preyed on the fears of white women, especially in the South, who were worried about all the changes happening in society, like industrialization and immigration.
So they were basically manipulating these anxieties to push their own racist agenda.
Exactly. They twisted the whole idea of female empowerment to fit their own hateful ideology.
Wow. That's messed up.
It is, and Lewis uses Alma Bridwell White as a really stealth example. She was the first female bishop in the United States and was super vocal about women's rights. She even started a magazine called Women's Chains to promote suffrage and equality.
So she was a feminist.
You'd think so, right? But here's the crazy part. She was also a supporter of the KKK.
Wait, what? How does that even compute?
It's wild, but White actually saw the KKK as an ally in the fight for women's liberation.
That's so hard to wrap my head around.
I know. It just shows us that even movements that seem progressive on the surface can be hijacked by dangerous ideologies. It's crazy to think about, right? How someone fighting for women's rights could be okay with the KKK. But anyway, Lewis's point is that this kind of KKK feminism is still around today, like with those Second Amendment feminists.
Oh, yeah, the ones who are all about gun ownership as a form of empowerment.
Right. And it brings up this whole question about violence and feminism, which Lewis talks about a lot. She says it's not that violence is always bad. I mean, even the suffragettes did some pretty destructive stuff to get their point across.
True, they did, like smashing windows and setting things on fire.
Exactly. But Lewis says the key difference is who or what the violence is directed at. So the suffragettes, they were targeting property, symbols of power, that kind of thing. But these enemy feminists like the KKK, they're aiming their violence at marginalized groups.
Ah, I see. So it's about like dismantling systems of power, not hurting people who are already vulnerable.
Exactly. And that brings us to another tricky figure. Lewis talks about the policewoman.
The policewoman.
Yeah, this chapter is all about how the image of a female police officer became this feminist idea, even though policing is so often associated with, like, violence and oppression. She uses Mary Allen as an example. She was a British suffragette who ended up founding a women's police force and becoming a full-on fascist.
Whoa, hold up. From suffragette to fascist. That's a pretty big jump.
I know, right? It seems super contradictory. But Allen believed that women were better at keeping things in order, like they could bring a more compassionate touch to law enforcement. She saw women police officers as these moral guardians protecting society from all the bad stuff.
But isn't that kind of like the civilizer thing we were talking about before? Like imposing your own values on others and being all we know what's best for you?
You got it. Lewis says Allen's whole vision of women's policing was all about control and punishment, not about addressing the real reasons why crime and inequality exist in the first place.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg.
Exactly, and this connects to those debates we're having today about police brutality and whether having more women cops would actually help.
Yeah, that's such a big conversation right now.
Right, and Lewis says, hold on a second. Just having more women cops doesn't fix the system. She thinks women officers often end up enforcing the same oppressive systems as their male counterparts.
So it's not just about who's doing the policing, but about how we approach justice altogether.
Totally. Lewis is pushing for a more radical change, like dismantling the whole carceral system, not just tweaking it.
That's a big ask.
It is, but Lewis doesn't shy away from big ideas, and it's not just about physical violence either. She also talks about the sex wars of the 70s and 80s and the rise of anti-pornography feminism.
Right, those were some intense times. A lot of strong opinions on both sides.
Totally, and this movement, led by people like Andrea Birkin and Catherine McKinnon, said that porn was basically a tool for men to dominate women, that it was a direct cause of violence against women.
That's a perspective that's having a bit of a comeback these days, especially among younger feminists.
Yeah, it's interesting. And Lewis actually agrees with some of the points made by anti-porn feminists. Like, she's not denying that the porn industry can be really exploitative and that power dynamics can be messed up.
So where does she disagree?
Her issue is that anti-porn feminism often demonizes all sex work. Like, it lumps everything together as exploitation, even if some people are choosing to do that work.
So it's about recognizing that people can make different choices within a system, even if that system isn't perfect.
Exactly. She also points out that trying to censor porn can actually make things worse.
How so?
It pushes it underground where it's less regulated and potentially more dangerous.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's messy. And Lewis makes us think about how we define harm and empowerment when it comes to sex. Like, what does it really mean to be free in that context?
That's a deep question.
It is. And these themes of censorship and control, they pop up again when Lewis talks about the feminationalist.
The feminationalist. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's that about?
So feminationalism is basically how feminist ideas get used to justify Islamophobia and being anti-immigrant.
Oh, wow. I've definitely seen that happening, especially when people talk about Muslim men being a threat to women's rights in the West.
Yeah, it's everywhere, right? And Lewis brings up people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Alice Schwarzer who push this narrative that Muslim women are all oppressed victims who need Western feminists to save them.
It's such a sweeping generalization, and it ignores the fact that Muslim women have diverse experiences.
Totally. And it plays into this whole clash of civilizations thing where the West is good and the Muslim world is bad, and it justifies all sorts of messed up action.
Like military interventions and stuff.
Exactly. It's this scary example of how feminism can be twisted to serve nationalist and xenophobic agendas.
That's disturbing.
It is. But it's not just Islamophobia Lewis is worried about. She also talks about how feminist rhetoric fuels transphobia, especially with the rise of trans-exclusionary radical feminism, or TERFism, as it's often called.
Oh yeah, TES. They're the ones who say that trans women aren't real women and that they shouldn't be included in feminist spaces.
Right. It's a really harmful ideology that's led to a lot of violence and discrimination against trans people, especially trans women.
Absolutely. It's terrifying to see how much hate is directed at the trans community.
Yeah, and Lewis is really clear that THMism isn't just some fringe thing within feminism. She says that these trans-exclusionary views have been around for a while, like way back to early feminist debates about what it means to be a woman.
So it's not just a recent phenomenon, it's like baked into some of the older feminist thinking.
Right, and she even calls out some big-name feminist icons like Germaine Greer and Adrienne Rich for holding these trans-exclusionary views.
Wow, that's heavy. It makes you rethink those figures we consider feminist heroes.
I know, it's uncomfortable. But Lewis isn't saying we should cancel them or erase their contributions. Her point is that we have to be honest about the complexities and contradictions within feminism and be willing to say, hey, even our heroes got some things wrong.
So it's about nuance, right? Recognizing that people, even feminists, can hold harmful views.
Exactly. And it's about striving for a more intersectional feminism, one that recognizes how different forms of oppression are connected and that fights for the liberation of everyone.
That's such an important message.
It is, and it leads us to one of the most thought-provoking parts of the book, Lewis's critique of choice as the ultimate feminist ideal.
Choice. Isn't that like the whole point of feminism? Expanding women's choices, like when it comes to reproductive rights or what kind of career they want.
You'd think so, right? But Lewis says this focus on individuals' choice can actually obscure the systemic forces that limit those choices in the first place.
Okay, I'm listening. Can you give me an example?
Sure, she talks about Sheryl Sandberg's lean-in feminism, where women are encouraged to climb the corporate ladder. And while that sounds good, Lewis points out that it ignores the very real barriers that make it super hard for many women to lean in, especially women of color and working-class women.
So it's like, sure, you can choose to climb the ladder, but the ladder's rigged against you.
Exactly. And Lewis also applies this critique to the conversation around abortion rights. She says that focusing solely on abortion as a choice ignores all the social and economic pressures that can force women into making that choice.
So it's not just about having the legal right to choose, it's about the context surrounding that choice.
Right. And Lewis even critiques the pro-choice movement for not always being willing to talk about the moral complexities of abortion. She says a truly feminist approach to reproductive justice needs to engage with those tough ethical questions and look at the social conditions that influence our reproductive decisions.
So it's not about simplifying things down to slogans, it's about digging into the nuances.
Exactly. It's about understanding that true liberation isn't just about individual choices. It's about selective action to dismantle the systems that create inequality.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of these enemy feminisms, they kind of miss the forest for the trees, They're so focused on individual choices that they don't see the bigger system at play.
Exactly. And that's what makes Lewis's work so important, I think. She's really pushing us to think beyond individual solutions and to look at the root causes of these problems.
So where do we go from here? Like, we've spent all this time unpacking these enemy feminisms, but what's the takeaway for us, the listeners? What are we supposed to do with all of this?
Well, Lewis doesn't give us like a step-by-step guide or anything, but she definitely leaves us with some powerful food for thought.
What do you mean?
Well, she basically says, be careful of easy answers and those simple narratives that make everything seem black and white. She wants us to really think critically about the feminist movements and figures we encounter.
And not just accept everything we hear at face value, right?
Right, like even if it comes from someone we admire or a movement that seems like it's on the right side of history, we have to be willing to question our own assumptions and biases too.
It's like she's saying, don't just be a follower, be a thinker.
Exactly. Because feminism isn't this one big unified thing. It's constantly evolving. There are all these different perspectives, and sometimes they clash. And that's okay. We don't have to shy away from that messiness.
Yeah, disagreements can be productive if they make us think more deeply about these issues.
Right. And Lewis is basically saying embrace that discomfort. Don't be afraid to challenge those dominant narratives, even if it's hard, because real change, systemic change, that's never comfortable. He requires us to constantly question the status quo and be vigilant about how power operates.
You know, this whole conversation has really made me think about how much responsibility we all have when it comes to social movements. Like, we can't just passively consume information. We have to be discerning and critical.
I agree. And it's not just about being critical of the other side or whatever. It's about holding ourselves and the movements we support to a higher standard too. Because like Lewis points out, even movements with good intentions can be used for harmful purposes.
That's a really powerful point.
It is. So it's about constantly learning, questioning, and like you said, being discerning about the information we're taking in and listening to the voices of those who have been marginalized and silenced.
Yeah, making sure we're not just amplifying the loudest voices, but seeking out the perspectives that are often overlooked.
Exactly.
Well, there you have it, folks. That was our deep dive into Sophie Lewis's Enemy Feminisms. I don't know about you, but this book definitely gave me a lot to think about. It's challenged some of my assumptions about feminism and made me want to dig deeper into these issues.
It's definitely a thought-provoking read. What was your biggest takeaway from our conversation today? Like, which of the enemy feminisms that Lewis talked about stood out to you the most?
That's a great question. I'm curious to hear what resonated with our listeners, too. So if you're listening, drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you thought of the book and our discussion.
And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this episode with anyone who might be interested in exploring the complexities of feminism. Because like we've been saying, this isn't about simple answers or easy solutions.
It's about engaging with the messiness, challenging ourselves, and striving for a more just and equitable world for everyone.
And maybe, just maybe, by having these conversations, we can start to dismantle those enemy feminisms and build a more inclusive and liberating future.
That's a goal worth striving for. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting the good fight.